Okay, great. So welcome to our weekly conversation on human-computer interaction and the future of work and well-being. If possible, turn on your cameras. We'd love to see everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers. So that will be Andrew Kuhn, Linda Boyle, Raffaella Sadun, John Lee, Manfred Selagi, and myself, and to the National Science Foundation for partially funding this event. The first part of the event will be recorded, and we're very much looking forward to questions from the audience. So please type your questions in the chat, and Andrew will monitor the chat and we'll kind of call on you to ask your questions. And stay with us for the second part. Following the conversation, we will just continue with that informal social event. So right now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Katherine Isbister. She's a full professor in the Department of Computational Media at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she directs the Center for Computational Experience. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you.
So the title of our conversation today is Supporting Quality Workplace Connection Using Suprahuman Technology. So what are suprahuman technologies? What make a technology superhuman?
Yeah, it'd probably be good to explain that, what I mean by that. So I think the clearest picture of it might be that optical illusion image, you know, the one with the two faces in silhouette looking at each other. And so it flips between seeing the people, but then also you can see a kind of candlestick or a vase between the two silhouettes. So I see superhuman technology as technology that is shaping that space, the space between the people. So thinking well about that negative space to create affordances for being better at being together. And I actually introduced this concept at a really wonderful event last year held in Halfway to the Future. It was in a really interesting format. So the organizers took some key papers from early in human-computer interaction. For example, Weiser's paper on Ubicomp, or I was thinking about those papers and the promise of HCI that got me into the field when I was a student. And at that time, it was this idea that technology would empower us to be human, only more so, like expansively human, humane even. And I realized that somehow the commercial practice of technology design has recently drifted into this very different space than the one that I'd been excited about. And that our technologies, as folks like Tristan Harris, and of course many others have been saying recently, have been pulling us deeper into this isolating attentional time sink, or into these oddly unsatisfying forms of online social interaction. So not necessarily supporting being together deeply and richly and well. And so that led me to thinking about Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. So probably many in the audience haven't read that. She's actually an emeritus professor from UC Santa Cruz, and it's a pretty great piece of writing about the dream of a fantastical hybridity of ourselves and technology. And in my case, I wanted to point out that we can imagine our social selves as fantastically and delightfully enhanced by technology. And so I coined this suprahuman term to point to the space between us and the opportunity for technology to heighten and enhance our social selves instead of diminishing this aspect of being human. And so from there in the paper, I set up some contrasts between isolating or individualist technologies and superhuman technologies that are aimed at knitting people together and honoring the collective experience. So if you want a simple example, think of the pull of your mobile phone in an in-person social situation. So you're with some people and you're discussing some point, and it's an informational point, so you want to quickly look something up to support the conversation. But the overall interface and the strategies of the phone's design are all about pulling in your individual attention and having this precise communication between you and the phone. And so often you'll get sucked right into checking messages and alerts, and you'll have a hard time coming back into focus and being with that other person. So the idea of superhuman technology is to start from the assumption that the shared experience is the central one, that it's deeply important, that it's worth holding a frame for, and that it's worth enhancing in a thoughtful way with our technologies and designing them from the bottom up to do so. So that's what the term means. And I'm happy to share the paper if anybody wants to read it a little bit more about it.
Sorry, apparently I have a dog in my lab.
Oh,
But
that's a good
please,
thing.
please do share the paper. That will be great. So what is the approach that you take in your research lab to realize or to ground this concept of superhuman technology? If you can give us example of some of the kind of superhuman technologies that you're experimenting with.
Yeah, absolutely. So we use a research through design approach, and essentially we're building alternative ideas for where technology might go. And if people don't know, research through design is a practice in HCI in which you build prototypes to help you build actionable knowledge and also to shape and validate theories that can guide other people's work. So people at CMU, such as John Zimmerman and Jody Forlisi, helped shape this notion, and also people like Bill Gaver. And interestingly, I recently discovered that learning and education folks use these practices too, but they call them design-based research. So let me give you an example of a cycle of research we've been doing in this area. We got interested in the potential for wearable devices to add to social connection and communication. So what if instead of being used to track steps like a Fitbit or to check messages and the time like an Apple Watch, wearables were somehow enhancing in-person interaction? And actually our first work in this area was designing wearables to be used in a play situation, live action role play. For those who are not familiar with LARP, these are mutual improvisational experiences that bring people together, and they enact situations while staying in particular roles that are assigned to them, but there's a lot of latitude for personal expression within the context of these designed experiences. And the LARP community has used technology to enhance their play for a while. And what's interesting about their practice with tech is they will not use it if it doesn't enhance the group experience of the LARP. So if a technology that they're trying out distracts a player away from the overall social situation, they just won't use it. So in that sense, they already have this value of superhuman technology in how they work with their design. So we partnered with a couple of different LARP designers to create wearables that were crafted specifically to enhance their social engagement with one another. And I actually have a video about the second project, which resulted in a wearable we call True Colors that I'm going to share. So give me a second, I'll do that. To find the right, here we go. So are you seeing the video?
It needs a couple seconds. It's
okay. Hang on, let me try again.
Okay.
Let me make sure that I think PowerPoint is actually acting up. Oh, I see what's going on. Okay. So.
Okay, now we see it.
Now you see it. Okay. So I will play the video and hopefully the sound will work.
It does.
In 2018, we co-designed a social wearable with a team of LARP designers. The device affords a variety of interactions, for example, expressive ones. You can change the color displayed or create brightness patterns. The device also affords competitive behaviors. You can stun people, and people can put you into a state of overload by entering a code on your back. In the game narrative, when you are overloaded, you are limited in motion and action. In fact, the device makes you vulnerable as it gets into overload automatically every now and then. And since the wearable makes you vulnerable, people can come and help you. They can pat your back to help your overload go by faster, or enter another code on your back to remove it instantly. They can also enter a very special code that will make you immune to overloads altogether. Our wearable affords a variety of interactions, both expressive, competitive, and friendly ones. We deployed 15 copies of the wearable in a 4-weekend LARP event. 109 people participated. We collected data by enacting researcher characters in the game, and we found something very interesting. People were very excited about the vulnerability afforded by the wearable. It encouraged people to care for one another. It made new opportunities for social interactions. That made us think, what if we design technology that makes us vulnerable? We feel we just scratched the surface of a really exciting opportunity.
So there you go. There's the video.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's a really, really fun project.
So how many of these objects did you make?
So we made 12 of the objects,
Oh.
and basically there were 3 classes of characters in this particular LARP. There were cyborgs, there were humans, and there were augments, and we decided to create the wearables just for the augment characters. And you could see from the video, we ended up creating this interesting interdependent feature. So of all those things, I mean, you saw the stun and the color changes, the thing they liked the best was when somebody became vulnerable with this overload and needed to be taken care of, and it created a lot of really amazing interactions. And initially, you were supposed to trade currency to get your wearable unlocked, but people didn't do that at all. They just wanted to help each other. It was a sort of an amazing altruistic thing. So at this point, you might be saying, well, what does this have to do with work, right? That's what this series is about. So have been actually translating the ideas into wearables for everyday work situations. So I want to show you some images of a set of wearables we created at the lab called Lagom. And this is a Swedish word for not too little, not too much. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation. And the idea is that each person in a group conversation will wear one. And hang on, let me just pull that up again. I'm sorry about the background noise. There's some construction going on outside. All right.
And it's a technology that makes us vulnerable and humane.
Exactly, it maddens us. Are you seeing the image of the Lagom?
Yes.
Cool. So, so basically, these are little wearables with a built-in gooseneck mic, and they're built on the Adafruit platform we were just talking about, or they're so wonderful for doing quick mock-ups. And what happens is that the Lagom is tracking when you're speaking. And if you speak for quite a long time, it will start giving you gentle haptic feedback, just letting you know, hey, you've been talking for a while. Similarly, if you're silent for a long time, it will also give you a little gentle haptic feedback. And then we use the lights on the front of the device. So at the end, everyone can press a button and they can see what percentage of the time they were speaking in the conversation. And so this was our idea for thinking of wearables not as just individual superpower type technologies that make people stronger, but thinking about something that is really attending to the space between people and working on a kind of thorny social problem, which in this case is conversational balance, right? So obviously there are a lot of really important nuances and details to work on with this kind of tech, but I think it's a really interesting proof of concept for thinking in a different way about where wearables could go. And this is something that we can imagine using in a workplace environment. So I don't know if people have seen, for a while there was this button like interface on the internet of like, when is a woman talking, when is a man talking, that people could use in meetings, and then it would calculate percentages. It's kind of like an extension of those kind of thoughts. So
I really like this idea. I can imagine that being used, in offsites. You want to hear from everyone, but sometimes people not sure where to come in. It's also interesting to test it within the virtual context, because I feel that when we talked about challenges in this environment, turn taking seems to be very delicate. You don't know when to jump in when the others are ready for you to jump in.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think I've talked to my students because they get really quiet in discussion, and that's one of the things they always say. They're like, well, like normally in a room, you get this kind of subtle encouragement that it's okay, that the floor is open for you, and it takes a lot more courage to jump in the Zoom environment, that's for sure.
Yeah, so if we're already talking about Zoom, let's transition to talk about kind of virtual environment.
Yeah.
Let's focus on virtual reality. So I know you have a Chi-19 paper that you and your students kind of look at how the creators of different social VR applications think about designing for social interaction specifically. Can you tell us about your findings and what are the design considerations that are important?
Look, I'm glad you asked about it because it's an ongoing stream of work. We've definitely been doing some extended thinking about exactly what is the experiential texture of social VR and how can you think well about building deep support for positive social experience into these environments. So the paper you're referencing was some initial research that was funded by Mozilla, and we did a survey of the main social VR environments at the time. And then we did a series of interviews with designers and developers for these platforms to see how they thought about shaping social interaction in their spaces. So there were a couple of key insights from this work in the paper. One was, you won't be surprised, many of these developers and designers were relearning lessons that we all are aware of from earlier versions of shared social world design. So some more experienced HCI practitioners in the audience might remember the CVE era, the collaborative virtual environments research, and things like the importance of places and spaces for setting a social frame for interaction. So, you know, you're going to interact differently if you're sitting around a campfire versus if you're in a very formal boardroom style conference room in VR, for example. Or also the importance of community management and providing ways for people to fend off unwanted interaction. But we also found some new opportunities that were related to the deeply embodied nature of social VR for weaving together designed elements to manage the space between people. So Josh McVeigh-Schultz, who was my postdoc at the time, and he's now a professor at San Francisco State, he likes to use the example of the rec room auditorium rooms for holding big discussions. So I've got one more image I want to share as I talk through that. Here we go. So in Rec Room, you know, they were trying to have these large gatherings. And at first they just kind of built a stage and then had an area where people could roam around with their avatars. And of course you can imagine there was chaos, right? People were just moving around, jumping on the stage, you know, just doing the things they expect to do in VR, teleporting around, entertaining themselves. They weren't paying attention. So then they came up with this idea of having these couches that you could teleport to and you'd be seated on and automatically face toward the stage, right? So kind of mimicking what happens in real life. Then they came up with using this, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this microphone object. It's in the top left slide. And so you couldn't speak unless you had this microphone. So up until now, this is all kind of recapitulating real world environments, like adding back in the cues that help people focus and manage their attention. But the thing that Josh and I thought was really cool was then they added this monster, and that's like up in the top left here. And what the monster does is he sits on the stage and he's looking wherever the microphone is. So that way you have a better sense of who's talking. And I don't know about you all, but I would love to have that at real conferences. So, you know, with audio systems at real conferences, right? It's like you hear someone speaking and you're kind of desperately looking around the room, trying to localize for yourself, where is the voice coming from? So this thing that we're really
Katherine, I think we lost you for a minute.
Actually,
Katherine, I think we lost you for a minute, so maybe stop sharing the screen. I don't know if that will help.
Support.
So as we're waiting for Katherine to come back, if you have questions, then please go ahead and type them. I'm sure she'll be reappearing in a moment.
And yeah, and we can also take a look at the paper that Andrew shared. It's one of my favorite these days because I think we're all kind of trying different tools. I'm going to share in my background. You get to see currently in my background kind of the HCI lab, but I also created for my students a virtual lab in Mozilla Hubs to stay. So this is kind of our virtual space. So Katherine works these days is very relevant, I think, to creating this sense of place and understanding the landscape. Katherine, you're back.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. Internet vagaries. My apologies. Anyway, yeah, it was
We
just.
lost you after the monster.
Oh, okay. So I was just saying that Josh and I got a grant from National Science Foundation.
Oh, congratulations.
To really dive into a research through design approach to craft social affordances in VR and think well about how do you really augment getting together in VR, which, as you were just saying, is timely because Zoom is driving us all crazy, right? Like we are looking for more depths of social cues and we can't travel like we used to. So there's an argument to be made that we're more willing to really play around with and push on the boundaries of VR to support us in getting together.
Yeah, and I think we're all kind of lacking this differentiation of spaces for social interaction, right? This is an informal talk. What is the right space for informal talk? Is it the same space that I'm using for the formal teaching and for talking to family members? We currently have this tool that used for everything, but it will be nice to differentiate.
Exactly. Like sometimes I end up in meetings in Skype and it's interesting. It's just a refreshing change of pace, you know, like it seems ridiculous. It's just a slightly different interface, but yeah.
So I want to transition. We talked a little bit about work. I want to transition to talk about well-being, because that's also kind of a focus of this series. And I'm very familiar with your work about games. You did a great deal of work about games, and specifically games and emotions. And I'm thinking at this time of social distancing and increased anxiety, how can games help people to improve their well-being?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think we finally, with this pandemic, so those of us in games research, there's always articles kind of catastrophizing spending too much time in games. But with the pandemic, it's the first time I've seen articles pointing out how kind of helpful games can be sometimes. So I don't know if anybody here has played Animal Crossing. But there have been a lot of articles here. I'm going to change my background to be Animal Crossing while we talk about Animal Crossing, or maybe we'll do springtime. That's everybody's streaming spring already.
I got to go get my daughter. She's a huge fan.
Yes. So like Animal Crossing is just this lovely little safe, happy world that Nintendo has made. And it used to be kind of a solitary experience, but the last few releases of the game, you've been able to visit each other and to trade things. So all of my friends on Twitter were like cultivating these turnips in the game and trading them and having a good old time with that. And I think another really nice example more recently is Among Us. So I have a 14-year-old daughter. Oh, you had an Animal Crossing birthday. That's extremely cool. It's like, it's the antidote for kind of angst and fear and kind of the grimness and the sameness. You know, you can really be together in this really happy space, right? So Among Us is another example. So I don't know if people watched AOC streaming, playing Among Us with people. So that's like that's kind of like a rowdy backyard play type of experience, right? But in both cases, and I talk about this in my book, which is How Games Move Us, like game spaces allow shared experience. Like it's not just about being a talking head. And I think that is incredibly refreshing and really good for us. Like we're just wired to want to do together in shared spaces, not just talk, but like do. And in these worlds, you can engage in this kind of elaborate play with objects or kind of feinting and teasing each other, right, in ways that just don't quite work. So I think at a social level, games are really important these days for people's well-being. There's also a whole generation of solo play games that are aimed at, I guess, you know, reminding people to take care of themselves, to just relax and not go into, I guess we call it doom scrolling, you know, but find other things to do. So like one that I really like is this hashtag self-care game that came out a while ago that you basically just lounging around in bed. You can do a little tarot reading for yourself. You can cuddle your cat, and it's just kind of reminds you that those things are okay to do. So I think there's a tremendous terrain that game designers are showing us for how to leverage the digital to create a different emotional and social texture for ourselves. So I think there's a lot to be learned there.
That's great. And maybe
And
we'll move
I'm
to
going to
Andrew.
go back to my other background, which is Ursula Le Guin's Berkeley writing porch. So this is like my happy place when I'm at work all day.
Beautiful.
We have some really good questions, and they touch upon all these issues that you've been discussing, Katherine. So I'd like to get to all of them, but I wanted to start with Heiko. So maybe Heiko, you can tell us your question, or I'm happy to read it if that's better.
Hang on, let me. Okay, no, you can't really see me, I guess, because it's quite dark now. So my question was, how can your work support like this non-verbal communication? I saw a lot of stuff like the microphone that starts to strangle you as you're speaking too much, or it kind of gives you the tap on the shoulder as you're not speaking enough. But what about those other means of communication that we can do in shared environments, like, you know, facial expressions or gestures, this kind of stuff?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And actually, one of the advisors on our new NSF proposal is Judy Burgoon, who is just an amazing scholar in nonverbal communication. And we're definitely experimenting with playing around with social proxemics and orientation. And as you know, it's tricky in VR. It's funny because VR claims to be very natural, but actually it's a really strange mishmash of highly artificial and physical. And so there's been a lot of really curious play with nonverbal communication in VR as a result. So things like people having little bubbling streams of emoji floating from their heads, or like funny rituals where people pretend to feed each other, even though of course you can't eat in VR. So we're playing around with these other cues, but we have to do it through the lens of the kind of bodily limits of that platform, right? And so, so that's a lot of the art of the research through design process, is figuring out, okay, given what we know about how human beings do rich social signaling, like what can we support and how could we strategically enhance it given the limitations of the platform? But I think that's the fun of it, right? Like often constraints lead you to create really interesting solutions. So we'll see.
So Heiko, you're asking about, you know, how people might interact, but then Ahmed, you had a question about, you know, sort of the outcome of that communication. Is that right? And Ahmed, if you're here, maybe you can tell us, or I'm happy to read it.
Yes, I'm here. Hi, thanks. Yeah, I think the question is there, but I was wondering, hi, Katherine, by the way.
Hi, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. Sorry for being late. I think missed the presentation, but I still wanted to join. I'm curious about your insights. I just wanted to ask, what do you think about the role of wearables or tangibles or non-screen based approaches to this kind of social environments that we have on Zoom? You know, Zoom fatigue or attention, or I have to constantly, for example, look at the camera right now so that you know that I'm listening to you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that either. I mean, I want to look at here because I still can listen to you, but that's not socially acceptable on Zoom. What do you think these approaches can bring in?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have barely scratched the surface. And I think part of it is it's so complex to think about. Well, like I was thinking about how, like Heiko at the beginning, it's like taking a walk while participating in this talk, which I think is fantastic. And which I think, you know, I have colleagues who often have walk and talk meetings because we have redwood trees right at our campus, right? It makes sense to walk around and talk and be in an environment. And, you know, I think these are exactly the right questions to ask, is like, how do you preserve shared attention, and how do you allow for being a physical being in your own space? And there's a lot of awkwardness in all of our platforms for this, whether it's VR, whether it's AR, whether it's, incorporating a wearable. We're just really primitive in our capacity to gracefully augment our overall holistic functioning, right? Even just at an individual level, much less at a social level. But hey, that's why we're researchers. Like, this is exactly what we should be tackling. Like, when is it right for the wearable to get involved, right? Is there a kind of, AR glasses plus a wearable on the wrist solution that allows for walk and talk meetings really nicely, right? Like, how do we take our individual physical bodies and our social bodies into account? So I think there's a role for these things to play. I just think it's extremely complex to break apart the constraints of the platforms, because we're still laboring under this set of assumptions from when computing resource was scarce and when we first started out with a display and a keyboard. Like we've taken, it's like the little fish crawling out onto the beach, like, wow, we have a multi-touch screen we carry in our hand. That's like, come on. We've had like these crazy visions from like 30, 40 years ago that go way past that, right? It's just super hard to build it out and like embed it in the social environment and like make it work. And I actually think like tools like the DIY environments, like the maker kits, have helped all of us to start prototyping wildly and testing new ideas on the wearables front. So I would expect to see a lot more innovation there. Also, we were talking before this started that the introduction of venture capital into the ecosystem has also created this this pressure to quickly come up with a little minimum viable product that scales really fast to a lot of people. So there are these little black holes of design space that prematurely form, and then everyone starts doing that same thing. So I think it's kind of, it's like monoculture farming. It's sort of, we're monoculture farming our new ideas in a kind of not productive way. So I think we should all pull in different directions and make this stuff really happen. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, thanks for the very nice reply. Thanks.
So let's get to one more question, which is Julia. And Julia actually extends this to the youngest among us. So I really like that question as well. So maybe Julia, you can tell us.
Hi, yes, my name is Julia, and given the pandemic, I'm now living from home again with my two nephews. Mm-hmm. And so something I've been thinking about a lot since they're 3 and 5 is this like idea of socializing the kids. And the way that basically their schools have shifted to be this like hybrid in-person and online space. So my 5-year-old nephew knows all about Zoom and how to change his virtual background and everything. But it's funny to like hear the class go on because it's all these like little kids speaking over each other and like the, adult on FaceTime trying to navigate, 15 little kids talking at once.
Yes.
And so I was just wondering, given our world situation of being isolated, as well as just like the increased mediation of life in general. Whether it would be useful to maybe like apply some of this tech to kids to like teach them how to socialize, like especially in this given context, or if like that's maybe like super depressing and like not what humans should do is like, take away like the curiosity, like the natural way that kids maneuver the world.
Yeah, I think I might also almost turn that on its head and sort of say, like, for some reason your question made me think of Mr. Rogers, who's this American public television educator who really made kids feel like he cared about them, and he kind of had the show at this slow and very thoughtful pace and really got into really interesting, even ethical questions with kids who are very young. And I almost think, I think we ought to put master educators and master practitioners to the challenge of making things like the tools we have, like Zoom, as developmentally nurturing as possible and kind of sharing best practices for how to do that, which I suspect have to do with things like finding ways to kind of, you know, if you think of call and response and singing, like finding ways to bring the kids into social rhythms using the technology in the way that the teachers would normally do it face to face. So I guess what I would say is, like, I would really like to see us as a society put attention to taking master practitioners, people, you know, if you think about, like, when we started doing this social tech research, I started thinking about sports equipment, musical instruments. I'm like, these are very subtle, beautiful social technologies. They work for the individual, they work for the group, they work for spectators. People spent hundreds of years developing them, and they're so amazing. And we need to have that same kind of subtlety of practitioner thought going into crafting things for children, I think. You know, so I don't think we should be afraid of blending tech into their world. The fact is it's already happening, but I think we need to be a lot more thoughtful about the knowledge base we're applying and who is helping us to shape that. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. And I think that we're going to stop the formal part of the conversations here. Thank you so much, Katherine. This is so relevant and intriguing. And I know that we all have more questions, so we will continue the conversation in a more social format after we turn off the recording. I just want to mention that next week is American Thanksgiving. So we'll be taking a break and come back in the first week of December with Chris Jansen. So hopefully we'll see everyone there.